Welcome to our lunchtime webinar. Thank you all for taking the time to join. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes while everybody who's invited enters the meeting, and we'll look to start just after 12 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody. It's now 12 o'clock. Those of you who've joined early, thank you very much. We'll just wait a minute to make sure that everybody who's been invited is on the call. As I say, we'll just give them a minute or so to join, and then we will get a start. Right, good afternoon, everybody. We'll start our webinar and we'll work our way through. As I say, good afternoon. Thank you for attending this question and answer webinar from ourselves at 3B Training. 3B Training have been in business over 10 years, and we're one of the largest training providers in the country. And about 18 months ago, we decided that we would have a look at the Building Safety Act, because ultimately it is going to be, and is at the moment, a game changer in the construction industry, both from a design point of view and also from a build point of view. My background as head of curriculum at 3B is that I've been involved in construction at all levels, from apprentice right through to senior project manager, working for plastering and dry lining companies. Been involved in training for the last 10 years, and I've been here at 3B. It's my 4th anniversary here today, actually. So what we decided to do was to put together this course, and we've been offering various versions of this for the last sort of year to year and a half, and at all levels, from tier ones right through to smaller companies. The uptake has been really interesting, both from a design point of view and also from a construction point of view. And this course, this little webinar today, is designed to kind of point you in the right direction, so that we will cover some of the questions that has been asked to me and my team over the last kind of year to 18 months. The course, as I say, is fairly wide ranging, and because we're going to have, I would assume, a large spread of companies, a large spread of experience of individuals, what we will do is we will take some of your questions towards the end. The questions will, if you stick them in the chat box, we'll collate them and we will answer them as quickly as we can and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation. So, why are we here today? Basically, the Building Safety Act kind of came into being on the back of Dame Judith Hackett's report, Building a Safer Future, which was commissioned after the Grenfell Tower disaster. Now, Grenfell Tower was a massive tragedy. 72 people died, and Judith Hackett, as ex-head of the HSE, was brought in to do a review of the regulatory system of the industry. And anybody who's had a chance to read the Hackett report will know that it is very critical of the industry as a whole and the regulatory system of the industry as a whole. And she talked about a change of culture, and that's the key driver. The key driver is we can't continue to do what we've always done in the way that we've always done it. We need to have a fundamental review of our processes, and everybody on this course will have a different opinion, will come from a different point of view. But the key message that Hackett has purported over the last 3 or 4 years is that change of culture, so that we make sure that the buildings that we build, the buildings that we design, are compliant with the relevant regulations and approved documents, so that people can feel safe and be safe in those developments, not just today, not just tomorrow, but throughout the life cycle of that building. And that's what the key driver is. The Building Safety Act applies to all buildings. HRBs, 18 metres or 7 stories that contain 2 or more residential units, whether you are working on those properties or on low-rise. The Act covers everybody. It covers all buildings, but there are additional responsibilities, additional systems in place for those HRBs. And the idea is that we raise the standard across the whole industry, not just those working on HRBs. So even if you are working on traditional developments, refurbishment work, maintenance work, the key driver is that we leave the buildings better than when we found them. And Grenfell didn't happen in splendid isolation. Grenfell was the end of a process where numerous opportunities had been missed by the industry, going right back to, Lacknell House in 2012, and right back to Summerland in 1973, where 50 people died on the Isle of Man, using systems that were highly flammable. And even looking today, a report came out last week about the East Village Management Limited, which took over the Olympic Park. They've had to set aside £432 million for remediation work on cladding and systems internally linked to fire safety. So any conception that we've got better over the years, everybody I speak to, when they're doing any kind of remediation work on cladding systems or on existing blocks, nobody ever says, tell you what, Pete, the standard of work was pretty good. It seems to have been either poor maintenance, poor installation in the first place, but also poor design to start with. And the key drivers of the Act is compliance in design linked to compliance in the build. Understanding the building regulations, understanding the approved documents is going to be a massive, massive piece of work throughout the industry. So, one of the questions or one of the statements I hear all the time is, oh, it doesn't apply to me. I only do domestic work. I only build houses. The Building Safety Act applies to all buildings, but an additional focus on those high-rise, high-risk buildings, which we'll call HRBs. You'll hear that phrase throughout the industry. HRBs, as I've said, 18 metres or 7 stories containing 2 or more residential units. 18 metres, some people think it's a pretty arbitrary height, but it's the height of a ladder on the back of a fire engine, basically. That's where that 18 metres comes from. And the second report, the public inquiry, which was led by Martin Moore-Bick, made 58 recommendations, of which the government has decided they're going to accept all 58 of them. And one of his recommendations was that the height of these buildings become lower, and over time, buildings should be risk assessed rather than using height restrictions. So you'll see over the next 5-10 years that the 18 metre will come down without a doubt to lower and lower, and the risk assessment process being used. Because again, if you've got a single story block that's full of people with limited mobility, getting them out of that building is a big issue. So the approved document B, the building regulations have been kind of tweaked and changed over the last few years. But what's going to happen again is a fundamental review of those building regulations and those approved documents. Moore-Bick again recommended that they become less performance-based and more prescriptive, must, to kind of mirror the language that's in absolute duty in the Health and Safety at Work Act. So all buildings, particular focus on HRBs, high-rise, high-risk buildings, but it affects everybody as well. Building owners, building managers, anybody who commissions building work, anybody who works in the building industry, right from site managers, project managers, down to operatives on site, especially when it comes to fire and structural safety. Those are the key areas that have kind of been highlighted in the Act. So at whatever level you're working at, on whatever project you are working at, new build, renovation, maintenance, the Act will have an impact on what we do to drive this culture change that Judith Hackett recommended in her original report, which was backed up by the Moore-Bick report, the Grenfell Phase 1 and Phase 2 reports. So it does apply to everybody. Another statement, again, I hear on a regular basis is, well, it's just CDM. It's just the same. If we can do CDM, principal designer, principal contractor, we can do the same under Building Safety Act. The only thing that's the same is the names of the duty holders, the client, the principal designer, designers, principal contractors and contractors. The titles are the same, but the requirements for those roles are completely different under Building Safety Act than they are under CDM. And the best way to highlight that is this little diagram here. Principal designer role under CDM is to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate health and safety in the pre-construction phase. Under the Building Safety Act, there's nothing at all to do with health and safety. Building Safety Act is about life safety, not site safety. So the principal designer role, take all reasonable steps to plan, manage, monitor and coordinate design work compliance. The role is all about design work compliance, making sure that the design complies to the relevant regulations and approved documents, making sure that the designers under the principal designer banner make sure that their designs are compliant. So it's an oversight role. What they're making sure is that those designs, whether it's from the M&E contractors, the dry lining contractors, are compliant with the relevant regulations. And then making sure also that being compliant with one set of regs doesn't negate another set. So having that holistic approach, that oversight, challenging designs, because especially if you're going to be working on new HRB projects, going through a gateway process, especially at Gateway 2, what the regulator is looking for is, they call it the identify, clarify, justify. So you need to identify which part of the building regs or which part of that design would require building control approval. Then you've got to identify which regulation or approved document that design piece links to. But most importantly, then you've got to justify, you've got to explain how that design piece actually does comply. Simply saying this installation complies with Part B isn't good enough. You've got to explain how it complies. So as a principal designer, what you're looking to do is making sure that the design people working with you and for you can do that, can both understand the regulations it's linked to, but also how you're going to demonstrate compliance. Because if you're unable to do that, Gateway 2 permission won't be granted, basically. From a principal contractor point of view, again, CDM, it's all about taking reasonable steps to protect the health and safety of those affected by the project. Absolutely fine. Building Safety Act, again, a completely different set of skills. Take all steps to ensure compliance with building regs. So the principal designer has to take all reasonable steps to manage design work compliance, but there's a greater responsibility on the principal contractor who has to take all steps, because ultimately this is the bricks and mortar development. This is the actual entity that people will be living in. So they have to take all steps to ensure compliance. So checking quality of the installations, making sure that what has been specified right from the word go is actually installed. Hackett talked about the end of value engineering. Again, speaking to lots of tier ones, value engineering is a very difficult thing to completely rule out. But right from the word go, the design is the driver. The design is the driver, especially on new HRBs. Because if the design is correct, you've got all your supply chain in line, you've got your properly tested installations, whether it's fire doors, fire screens, fire lock, whatever it is, all in place before you get to Gateway 2. The regulator is looking for a completely put together design to REBA stage 5, basically, at Gateway 2. So the way we do things will have to change. The build and design model that we've used for years will not be good enough under this new regime. So there will be more time spent on design, more money spent on design at the front end. So there'll be a change of relationship between the design and the client. The client needs to understand that if they are going to put a project through the gateway system, these things need to be in place. In order to help principal designers and principal contractors, there's two what we call PASs, PAS, PAS 8671 for principal designer and PAS 8672 for principal contractor. And what those documents do is set out the minimum standard for an entity or an individual wanting to operate as principal designer or principal contractor. And it sets the bar for everybody, whatever project you're working on, but then it sets the additional requirements needed for those who are going to work on HRBs. So the driver coming from Hackett is all about that competence. And we're going to talk about competence in the next slide. So the PASs are available online. And again, a lot of the companies that we've been working with are using those almost like a gap analysis, enabling them to decide what they can do, what they can't do, and need help to develop as part of their skill set. So just because you haven't got those skills internally at the moment doesn't mean to say you can't develop them or you can't bring people in. But competence is the key driver. Competence, as I say, when you look at the Hackett report, one of the criticisms was that, we've kind of not really pushed our competence agenda. And that was backed up by the Moore-Bick report. Anybody who's looked at the phase 2 Grenfell report will remember there's a Grenfell web of blame in the executive summary. And what that does, it highlights, several individuals and companies who were operating outside of their competence, right from the architectural practice through to the contractors. And the big drive now is making sure that people who develop, design, construct, manage, maintain, and own residential HRBs recognise that they are the key players in this culture change. And the secondary legislation that came through in 2023 required the duty holders demonstrate the competence of their workforce. Competence, making sure that you are properly qualified, but also making sure that you can demonstrate that competence. And there is an acronym called SCEB, which we'll look at in the next slide. But anybody going right back to section 11 of the building regs, responsible for appointing a designer or a contractor, must show that the people that they are employing, taking on at whatever level, can prove both their individual competence and their organizational capability. So what's organizational capability? It's that overall performance of an organization. It's the systems that they use, the monitoring systems, the quality systems, the mapping against building regulations and approved documents, setting up a brand new quality management system if there isn't one in place, improving, changing, developing existing quality management systems, because ultimately making sure that the organization will be able to demonstrate that group competence is massively important. That companies, organizations aren't working outside of their skills and knowledge and experience. The architectural practice at Grenfell were a well-respected company with good results, but they had no experience at all of working on the kind of project that Grenfell was. And that was highlighted in the phase 2 Moore-Bick report. So it's really important that as a company that you are able to demonstrate your organizational competence, but also as an individual, your SCEB, your skills, your knowledge, your experience, and your behaviors. Now, skills, knowledge, experience, we can kind of quantify them. The skills we can get through development. The knowledge, again, you develop that over a period of time, whether that's practical knowledge or theoretical knowledge, design work knowledge, building knowledge. Experience, again, just because you've done something for 25 years doesn't necessarily mean you've been doing it right for 25 years. But that experience, that ongoing learning is massively important. But the behaviours is a much more difficult thing to quantify. And in the PASs, it talks about not doing work beyond your capability. So I know, coming from a subcontract background, we always used to say yes and then think about how we were going to do it. Now, in the regime, is really not looking for that. We're looking to make sure that individuals within the supply chain at whatever level are competent and understand that their behaviours will have an impact on the progress of that job, but also of the safety of that job. If we are putting in fire life critical systems, making sure that firstly we've got the right product which has been specified, that's been properly tested, and then we fit in it to the manufacturer's guidelines. And then the principal contractor, who has that overall responsibility for compliance on that job, will need to check photographic evidence, geotagging, those kind of things, to make sure that it is fitted alongside manufacturer's guidance. Because another area is what we call golden thread. Golden thread tells the story, the lifestyle, the life cycle of that building. On new HRBs, it starts right at the concept. It works through the design, it works through into the build process, and ultimately into the maintenance of that development. Excuse me. So that golden thread, accountability, corporate accountability, individual accountability, making sure that you're following the quality systems that are embedded in the organizational competence route that companies are going through at the moment. So qualifications by themselves aren't enough. Qualifications are a good starting point, but it's the link between that and the behaviours. And again, going back to Judith Hackett, the change of culture, this is what we're looking for. Making sure that we're doing what we say we do. We're installing what's been installed, what's been specified right from the word go. And if we get that all together, we've got a quality management system operated by competent people in an organizational structure that pushes quality, not just time and cost. Hackett again said that, we were an industry that was having this race to the bottom. Can we do it quickly? Can we do it cheaply? Time and cost now should be of equal value to the quality of the building. We shouldn't be compromising, because ultimately what we're looking to do is make sure that we don't have another Grenfell. There are over 8,000 blocks nationwide that have similar issues to Grenfell, and over the next 10 years we're going to have to remediate all of those. And not all of them were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s. As I said, the Olympic Village, 2012, £432 million worth of remedial works needs to be done on that project. Were the companies who worked on that doing anything different to any other company? No, they weren't. Were the companies at Grenfell doing anything different to what the majority of companies were doing in London, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle? No, they weren't. That was the culture of the industry. We need to change that culture. And as I said, we've had numerous opportunities over the years, over the last 50 years, to do it ourselves. Now we're a regulated industry. Now we've got the Building Safety Act with all the implications that that has. At the moment, there's been no prosecutions under the Building Safety Act because it's that new. There will be, according to the regulator, a prosecution or two this year, and that will again crystallize the thought processes within the industry. But ultimately, quality, both in the design and in the build, compliance with building regulations and approved documents, both in the design and the build, and companies and individuals being able to demonstrate both an organizational capability and individual competency linked to a quality management system, linked to an industry that is not just trying to do everything on the cheap and trying to shave money off the project. That's the only way it's going to happen. And again, Judith Hackett talked to the Construction Leadership Council at the end of last year. And she said, as the industry is moving and, the interest that we've seen as a company over the last year has demonstrated that the industry is interested in talking about this. Does anybody know all the answers? No, they don't. And anybody who tells you that they do is a liar. There is guidance out there. And when we design our courses, we make sure that we are using trusted sources, the PAS documents, the regulator. And when we get all this together, the awareness, right from tier ones right through to individual smaller companies, because it affects everybody will have a part to play. So demonstrating competence, understanding that this isn't the same as CDM, and making sure that we understand that everybody has a part to play will be the massive, massive difference to this industry that Judith Hackett called for as part of her Building a Safer Future report. So how can we help as a training company? We worked with the CITB about 18 months ago to get our Understanding the Building Safety Act approved as the recognised standard, which means that it is eligible for grant funding. So the awareness course that we do, the Understanding the Building Safety Act course, that is available both online and in the classroom. We do it from a public point of view. We can do it individually tailored to companies. What we like to do is speak to companies before we go in and deliver this course, so that we can use their systems, their policies, their procedures, so that the people on the course actually can see how it works for them. As well as the grant funding, there are other funding routes available. There's the Registered Employers CITB fund via the Skills and Training Fund and the Employer Network. And that QR code will take you to our homepage. As I say, you can book directly with us. And as I say, it can be done either online or in person. The dates for that course are filling up massively quickly at the moment. We also offer 2 e-learning courses, a shorter Building Safety Act Awareness e-learning course. We've developed this over the last year, our e-learning department, and the Change Control course. Again, although these aren't grant claimable courses, there are other funding routes available for them. And again, they can be booked directly with us. So there's a variety of ways that we can help you as an organisation, both from classroom, online, a variety of ways to do it. So that just gives you an overview of what we are looking to do. So we are, throughout the course, hopefully you have been putting some questions into the chat box. I've got a couple. Can you expand on how the BSA affects non-HRB projects? Yeah, especially from a quality competence point of view, even if you are working on, say, traditional houses. So you will have party walls, especially if you're building townhouses and stuff like that. Party wall details with fire breaks between each individual property, making sure that the design at the beginning incorporates those, making sure that those fire resistant materials are installed correctly, making sure that the quality of those products are done. And from a competence point of view, whether you're working on HRBs or non-HRBs, the competence bit is going to become massively important. Simply having a card isn't going to be enough. I know the grandfather rights have been taken away at all levels. So, having a labourer's card now means all you do is labour. So that goes after 2 years. And then you need to prove that, A, you are just labouring. And if you're moving on to do anything else, there will be an impact on that. So, yeah, absolutely. BSA affects both HRBs and non-HRBs. Minor changes, notifiable changes. So as part of the change control process on HRBs, there is a list of, on the government website, of what's classed as a major change. A major change is at Gateway 2, say you've got your building control approval at Gateway 2 for, say, a 15-story block with 4 flats per floor. If you decide you're going to stick an extra couple of floors on top of that in the build stage, that is a variation from the Gateway 2 building control approval, and you need to go back through the regulator for additional building control approval, and work on that particular bit has to stop until you get that additional building control. So as a general rule of thumb, major changes tend to be changes to height, width, compartmentation, changes of materials, whereas notifiable changes tend to be more process driven. So if you've got, say, your site team and you change your site manager halfway through the project, you need to inform the regulator of that change, and then you also need to submit a competence declaration with that individual's kind of SCEB. But work can continue once you have notified the regulator. So there tends to be very little break in that process. But major changes are a big thing, because when you look at the amount of time it's taken at the moment to get through Gateway 2, you don't want to add any additional time to your program due to changes. So this is where having that design really tied on at Gateway 2, that's the important bit, making sure that doesn't go. If a company is only adapting bathrooms and not building houses, how can they comply? This comes down to building control. If you're changing kind of like for like taps and stuff like that, then it doesn't really affect it. If you are changing pipe work that would require building control approval, that's an issue. And again, speaking to a lot of maintenance companies, what they're trying to put together with advice from the regulator is almost a list for their operatives as to what requires building control approval and what doesn't require building control approval. As I said, there is guidance out there. I can, if we take your email address, I will send that guidance on to you. But as I say, it's all about building control approval when it comes to adaptions and things like that. Would this piece of legislation apply to the perimeter of the building, such as fencing or automatic gates or barriers? That's a really interesting question. It's all about a building, so I would assume that it doesn't cover the perimeter of the building. But what I can do again is I'll have a look at that. That's a question that in this last 18 months nobody's asked me, which is also a good thing. My impression that it doesn't, but if the automated gates or barriers were attached to the building, I think that would have an impact. And also, if those in the design stage on a new HRB, you have to submit a fire safety case, and part of that safety case is access for emergency vehicles, because again, one of the issues at Grenfell was there were a lot of fire engines couldn't actually get access to that. So I would assume that part of that fire safety case at Gateway 1 would include information about that, how you would get access to that development as part of a fire safety strategy. So, and especially at Gateway 2, again, as part of the worked example, I think it would have an impact on that. I'll have a look at the specific guidance out there, but as I say, as part of the fire safety case, it'll definitely have an impact, because we need to demonstrate how you are going to get emergency vehicles into that development. So as part of that fire safety case, that information would need to be part of that thing. Do you think the gateway approval process will be brought into non-HRBs in the future? Gateway 2 at the moment is not working as it possibly should be working. At the moment, there has been new guidance published which says that from application to decision will be up to 18 weeks. Now, I was working with a company 2 weeks ago, and they were on the 4th extension asked for by the regulator, and they were on somewhere around about week 37. So at the moment, I can't see it going to non-HRBs at the moment, because I think they've got enough issues getting the HRBs through. There is sufficient resource in the UK for approval of these gateways in a reasonable time. I think that's a really good point. One of the big issues that the regulator has had is putting together their multidisciplinary teams. And initially, the problem was because the regulator doesn't actually employ any fire experts or structural people, putting those teams together was a major issue. They're now looking to recruit those people, but I've seen no evidence at all, either in the press or from any guidance that the regulator has got, that it's improving. So I don't think there is sufficient resource in the UK, as a personal opinion, and a reasonable time. As I say, there was an article published last week in Construction Enquirer where some major investors and banks and institutional investors are moving out of the HRB market and investing in lower rise properties, simply because of the Gateway 2 issue. It doesn't negate them having to fulfill the requirements of the Act from record keeping and competence and things like that, but it does do away with the gateways. So it really does need some work and some additional resource put into that. Current examples of guidance documents available to identify no matter how companies individual might demonstrate appropriate competency. Yeah, there was after post Grenfell, there was a document produced which set out PAS. It was British Standard 8670, which was they called it the Flex, and what that did was enabled individuals and skills organizations to set up their own individual kind of qualification, but not just qualification, but also experience frameworks. 8671, 8672 sprung out of that, and you will see over the next year there were 12 working groups set up, right from site managers, site supervisors, right through to architectural stuff, and these have been published at the moment. So what this does will enable awarding bodies and people like that to set up their own competency frameworks based on the requirements in British Standard 8670. So 8670 is the overarching competence document, which enables, as I say, awarding bodies and trade organisations to produce their own competence frameworks. So yeah, you'll depending on what part of the supply chain you are working on, you should see over the next few years, those being published. Again, as we've said, qualifications alone aren't really good enough. So it's an ongoing process, basically. No drawings are held on file beyond the initial planning drawings, and no owner manual for an HRB completed. Would that be a breach of the BSA? What we're seeing all the time, going on to something like a Regulation 38 file. The Regulation 38 file has been part of the building regs for the last 30 years, and that contains fire and life safety information given to the building owner at the end of the process. Now, what, again, experience over the last year working with different companies at different levels is that even that basic Regulation 38 file isn't there, and that's been a requirement for a long time. Would it be in breach of BSA? 2015, well, the Act didn't come into force until 2022, so I think you'd be struggling for retrospective things. But what companies need to do, if you find that the project that you're working on doesn't have any of those files, then you would need to start to create that from the time that you start working on that project. That fire and emergency file needs, it's an extension of a Regulation 38 file. But as I say, again, my experience over the last year is that in some projects it's there. In some projects, somebody was telling me that they were told that the housing association had a Regulation 38 file, but it was stored on microfiche, which is a bit difficult to access these days. So from a breach of BSA point of view, 2015, retrospectively, you ain't going to get prosecuted, but it just means that those projects that are being worked on now, that fire and emergency file, which feeds into the golden thread system, will need to be started to be produced, because the regulator, especially if it's an existing HRB, they can start and ask for building safety certificates, of which the building safety case would be part of that process. And therefore, the information that you are kind of gathering on an ongoing basis, that would feed into both the golden thread and also into the fire and emergency file. So yeah, a lot of work is being done now to piece together information that wasn't there to start with, and that again is something across the piece. It's something that I've come across on a fairly regular basis, basically. What else have we got? Does the gateway process only apply to buildings in construction, or does it apply to existing HRBs that are having significant remediation work undertaken? Yeah, if revite work would go through Gateway 2, and there's the process at Gateway 2 for remediation work. The timeline for acceptance seems to have been much better. There are a lot more remediation work Gateway 2 applications gone through than there has new work gone through. But again, the regulator would still be asking for the building safety case if you've got it, what your construction control plan is going to be, especially if it's an occupied building and the majority of remediation work is going on in occupied buildings. So you've also got to demonstrate that the work that you're doing doesn't have a negative impact on the building safety case. So that needs to be, going back to that previous question, picking up a lot of information that possibly isn't there to start with, feeding that into the process. So your construction control plan, your mandatory occurrence reporting system, because again, mandatory occurrence reporting is all about non-compliance. So if you are removing, cladding or missing fire barriers, that is non-compliance with building regs and approved document B. So that needs to be recorded, given to the building owner, which hopefully will be passed on to the regulator. Now, as I say, mandatory occurrence reporting is massively important when it comes to putting together the evidence of work that's gone on in the past. If you think mandatory occurrence reporting similar to a RIDDOR reporting system, whereas RIDDOR is all about accidents, incidents and dangerous occurrences, this is about incidents of non-compliance. Lacking in fire that would lead to they talk about a significant number of deaths or injury to a significant number of people. So anything that ticks those boxes would need to be recorded and also then given to the client. What some organizations are doing is they're almost having a triage kind of system, so that these things are identified, remediated, recorded, given to the client, and it's the client's responsibility to pass it on to the regulator. It should be seen in a positive way. Some organisations are saying it's a bit of a whistleblower's charter, but personally, I think it's a really good system to sort of pick up on the things that have happened on a regular basis. Poorly fitted cladding, lack of fire breaks, all those things happen on virtually every development that I've talked to. As I said at the beginning, very few companies actually say to me, "Tell you what, Pete, the work has been particularly good underneath." If the installation hasn't been good, then the design hasn't been good. So it's the link of those two. So yeah, it applies to HRBs having the remediation work done as well, because again, you are taking stuff off and putting it back on again. So it requires building control approval. So anything that requires building control approval, that's the thought process we've kind of got to get into it. And it goes back to that question about bathroom adaptations and stuff like that. Making sure that the operatives know that if they do one kind of work, then that doesn't require building control approval. That's fine. If they change pipe work, especially if it's going through a fire resistant wall, that does require building control approval, and it always has needed building control approval. But lots of the industry hasn't done it. It simply hasn't done it. It's just we've just got on with it. So some fire door replacements, should this be an application of the gateway process, change in plan per end of the life cycle? So is that part of the planned maintenance? If it's part of the planned maintenance, then it doesn't need to go through a gateway process. Changed in planned project. Yeah, absolutely. So if you've got a planned maintenance project on that's changing or doing fire doors every 6 months, every year, that should be recorded as part of the golden thread. And if there isn't a golden thread, then it's the client's, the building owner's responsibility to put that into place. So again, planned maintenance doesn't need to go through the gateway process. If you're doing wholesale refurbishments on an HRB that involves building control, then that would need to go through the gateway process. 30-year rule. Historic 6-story building, brand new story, 7 stories or 80 meters. Again, that's a real specific question. If you allow me a couple of days to research that and get back to you on that answer. The amended defect label, will this allow today's regs being backdated up to 30 years from 2022? Again, that's another really good question. The liability process on new work has changed. Again, that's a question that nobody's asked me over the last year. So again, I'll make a note of that and I will get back to you on that. My impression is that you can't put today's regs back 30 years, but again, under BSM, viewers replace fire doors in non-HRBs. Current standards with BM trialing down there, you stand up building control sign off. Under BSA, even if you were to replace fire doors in non-HRBs, the current standards, such as a BM Charter certified door set, but you still need to obtain building control sign off. In theory, yes, you would. This is again, when it talks about doing things differently, because again, it's not just the fire door. The fire door, it's as much about the gap that the fire door goes into as the fire door itself. So you could have the best fire door in the world, but if the gap that it's going into is filled with squeezy foam and chip papers, then that fire door is a bit redundant, basically. So as soon as you start to take architraves off and look at the gap that those doors are going into, whether it's a door set or whatever, getting advice from, I would always ask the local authority building control and get their opinion on this, because as I say, there's lots of doors that have got the proper testing, the certification and everything, but the gaps that those doors are being fitted to are not compliant. And again, some of the partition walls that those doors are going into, and this is one of the issues that's going on at the moment when it comes to testing, is that, yeah, we've got fire doors fitted to partition walls, but there is no standard as to what those partitions will be, whether it's got the 30-minute standard or not. So what a lot of organizations are doing is getting advice from the local authority and also from fire experts, because even the plasterboard manufacturers are sometimes loathed to give fire data out on new installations, and on old installations you're kind of really fighting against the breeze. So if you're taking those doors out and you're finding that the gaps that the door's going into is non-compliant, you need to be speaking to the local authority building control. Traditionally, they should be involved in that, whether it's an HRB or a non-HRB, because again, that gap is down to building regulations as well. So anything that requires building regulations, I would be speaking to the local authority. Right, that's all the questions. Thank you all very much indeed for attending. We will send out a copy of the slides. And as I say, if you've got any specific questions that we were unable to answer today, We've got your email addresses, and we'll endeavour to get some answers out. We'll send some guidance out to point you in the right direction. And as I say, if there's anything specific, by all means, email us. We'll have a look at them, and we'll try and get back to you as quickly as possible. Thank you all very much.